Welcome back. We're talking about undernutrition throughout the world. This is the second part of our video. So undernutrition in the developing world, some of the things we're going to talk about are why does undernutrition continue despite adequate food resources? What are some solutions to limiting population growth, especially in developing countries where birth rates are high, or should we be doing that? How have war and declines in natural resources contributed to undernutrition in developing countries? What effects have overpopulation and increased urbanization had on nutrition and disease risk? How many people globally are currently infected with HIV, and how is this transmitted? And what have the trends been in terms of numbers of new cases since about 2001? So when we look at undernutrition throughout the world, these are some of the places with the highest number of individuals that are experiencing this. Like, for instance, Central Asia, Turkey area, about 10 million people. Other developing regions altogether, about 15 million. Western Asia, 19. North Africa, 13 million. Latin America and the Caribbean, 37 million. Southeast Asia, about 64 million. Eastern Asia, 161 million. Sub-Saharan Africa, 214 million. Southern Asia, about 276 million. By the way, Oceania, I had to look that up myself. Australia, New Zealand, the Polynesias, that type of thing. Only about 1 million, but of course they don't have much of a population. So Millennium Development Goals, these are 8 goals that have been set by the United Nations to address poverty, hunger, disease, illiteracy, environmental degradation, and discrimination against women. This was created in about 2000, and they reevaluate it every so often. These are supposed to improve the living conditions for many people. And of course, we're going to talk about the different things that are affecting both economic, politically, social factors affecting our food supply. So, population food ratios. There's an extreme imbalance in population growth and food. By the way, by the year 2050, we expect between 1 to 3 billion more people in the world. There's already about 7.5 billion people in the world right now. We should not be able to sustain that many people by 2050. So you're looking at a growing population of food insecurity. Now, the question is, do we do this birth control thing? Do we do like China, where everybody's only allowed to have one child? What exactly are we supposed to do? And, you know, when we say by 2050 we can't sustain that many people, the real question is, can we not sustain that many people because people don't know how to feed themselves, like we've talked about? They don't know how to put a garden in their backyard. They don't know how to raise a chicken. Or is it because there's not enough land in this world for people to farm? And that's not the case. And instead, what happens is we say, well, we need to give people birth control. We need to control the population. I don't know. My personal opinion is, and that's my personal opinion, I don't agree with that. I think what needs to happen is we need to learn to teach people. We need to learn how to feed ourselves to teach people how to feed each other. More than 75% of all hungry people live in rural areas of Africa and Asia and depend on local agriculture. Again, they don't depend on themselves. Most successfully long-term solutions to excessive population growth, especially for women in developing nations. So we want to see an increase in income, improving education. Economists estimate that food production will increase more rapidly than the population. And that is something that is going to happen if we can teach people how to take care of themselves. And then, of course, we've also talked about the supply chain. This is a big issue. And right now we're experiencing a lot of this supply chain issue. You know, if I have to wait for food to come from Argentina to get to me, how am I going to make sure I get fed? If I have to wait for food to travel all the way across the United States to California from, I don't know, New Jersey, how am I going to make sure that I'm fed? What if there's a gasoline shortage? What if there's some other kind of shortage? But if I'm growing carrots in my backyard, do I really have that kind of food insecurity? So supply chain is a huge issue if I don't know how to take care of myself. And of course, in the long run, increasing that education, increasing the income because of that education obviously is very important. And when we talk about, especially for women in developing nations, these women also need to learn nutrition. And in these nations, they're not able to be educated. And so this is a huge issue. Now, even in the United States, we see these single families we've talked about, and the more educated the woman becomes, the greater the likelihood of pulling the family out of poverty. So the most viable farmland in the world is already in use. But that doesn't mean that other farmland can't be converted. So, for instance, in Israel, many years ago, they were farming in the desert. And now Israel is becoming an oasis in the desert. And they have learned how to improve farming practices. They have learned how to increase the ability to obtain water and how to change the topography of the desert. And what I mean by that is they create what are called swells. And so they do these big dips in the desert. And so they're able to accumulate more water, and then they grow on the banks of these dips. And there's just all kinds of different ways to learn to be able to farm on acreage that, well, you assumed could not be farmed on. And that's anything but true. And you know, some of the best farming acreage in the world is covered by cement and asphalt. And maybe if we have a problem with farming, maybe we shouldn't be plowing under and cementing over all of the best farmland. So our farmable acreage is decreasing every year. So the world's sustainable food output is being depleted, no kidding. So food production is less developed in certain countries, and these countries will not keep up with the population growth. So people have to learn how to be better farmers. And so we're looking at problems with rapid depletion of that farmland, rapid depletion of natural resources, such as fish and water, poor infrastructure, high debt. This is an issue. If your country is in debt, they can't afford to help take care of farmers. And farmers, they need to be taken care of because there can be all kinds of issues. So maybe one year you get some kind of pest that comes through and devours your entire crop. And if you want that farmer to continue the next year, they may have to be subsidized. They may have to be helped so that they can continue to produce food. There are imbalances within the food and the population. And of course, a lot of those imbalances are caused by politics. So if I have war in my country, I can't stick around to farm. And, some of the countries in Africa right now, one of the big deals is these warlords have decided that their country is going to make money, and they're going to be making money by mining. And one of the things they mine is cobalt, and they're mining tons of cobalt, and that cobalt is being used for electric cars. And these countries can't feed their population. And why? Because, well, they've moved all the farmers out so that the developed countries can have plenty of cobalt so that they can have electric cars. So how do we handle that? We're trying supposedly to have electric cars so that the climate is better, but now this country can't feed itself because the other countries are using its cobalt. And yeah, it becomes an issue that the world has to deal with. And then, of course, we're going to talk about AIDS and how that has affected certain countries. So population growth in developing countries. The world's population, more than 3/4 live in the developing countries, and more than half live in Asia. The poorer countries have higher birth rates. Birth control is effective in developing countries if it's used. And of course, there's not a lot of access to this. But again, we talk about birth control, and the question is, do these countries, do we need to just give them birth control as a way to feed their population? Do we have to keep the number of these people down in order to feed them? Or do we need to teach them how to feed themselves? So improved living conditions correlate to slower population growth. Imagine that. So food supply not distributed equally within a country is a big issue, so that the poorer people aren't getting as much food and the richer people are. The larger family size in a lot of countries, it ensures longevity of the family, but that's because their kids are dying. They're undernourished, and they're thinking, I have to have many children because, just like it used to be in the United States once upon a time, a person would have 10 children, and maybe one of those children would live to adulthood. So maybe if these countries are able to feed themselves and the disease levels are lower, people are able to live longer. I don't have to have so many children, and I can see my children into adulthood and into old age. Of course, there are some countries where cultural and religious beliefs are going to require them to have larger families, and that's what it was like in the United States for a number of years. So we talked a little bit about war and politics, civil unrest. This is a problem, has been off and on in many continents, and we see obviously an increase in military spending. And globally, 1 in every 22 humans are a refugee. And this is a big problem because people are leaving their countries. They're being displaced. There are lots of people living in refugee camps right now as we speak, and these camps do not have appropriate nutrition. These individuals are trying to find asylum and get into countries where they can live and flourish, but it's not always easy. And whether it's political asylum or religious asylum, it doesn't matter. You see a lot of disease in these refugee camps and a lot of malnutrition. So this civil disruption, this war, of course, is contributing to the undernutrition, contributing to the food infrastructure, the production of food to be completely destroyed. I mean, you can't be a farmer if bombs are going off. So we have what's called a global hunger index, the World Health Organization. This is what they use to measure and track hunger worldwide. And it also helps to track how, whether the hunger is due to politics or whether it's due to war, whatever is going on. This is what it tracks. So one of the other issues we've talked about, besides just agriculture, is the rapid depletion of natural resources. So, you see forests being burned down, and you see water being used up, and of course, farmland being plowed under and cities built on it. So one of the things that has been introduced, and this actually started like in the 1960s, this was called the Green Revolution, and this was to increase crop yields, okay? And what they were working on were better types of fertilizers, better types of pesticides, better types of irrigation, better plant breeding, anything that had to do with farming. They wanted to be able to improve on this. And let me tell you, they have. Scientists, farmers, people involved, they have just increased the ability of farmers. For instance, what a farmer in the early 1900s, one farmer on everything that they did in a year might be able to feed 20 people. But that same plot of land nowadays, that farmer could, with everything that we know, probably feed 200 people. So all of these practices have increased productivity of the farm. But again, we're increasing productivity, but we're not really looking at how to manage the soil. So if I don't have enough nutrients in the soil and I'm not keeping the soil healthy, then I'm not going to be able to continue to farm on that land. And of course, once upon a time, what we used to do is we'd farm on a piece of land, and then every 7 years, for one entire year, you didn't farm anymore. And the thought was that gave the land a little bit of time to heal itself, and the nutrients would come back and we would be able to replenish that soil. Well, since this green revolution, we thought, oh, well, we don't need to do that anymore because we're just going to add fertilizer to the soil. And by adding fertilizer, that'll make it just fine. But what we found is the soil is far more delicate than we originally thought that it was. The soil requires more than just adding a bit of fertilizer to it. And so taking that soil and just letting it go, what we call fallow, just letting it sit for a year is actually better, but it lowers productivity of the farmer. So we also talked about the soil not being appropriately taken care of so that you have that desert effect. And then deforestation, water shortages, these are all issues that are happening as far as farming and natural resources are concerned. So food production has to keep up with population growth, and so agriculture has to be sustainable. That means we need to be doing something that can improve the amount of food that's produced, as well as keep the farmland healthy. And so there are various different ways that we'll talk about, but some people believe that a more natural approach is appropriate, and some people believe a more scientific approach is appropriate, and so we'll talk about biotechnology approaches also. So for people around the world, inadequate shelter and sanitation is a huge issue. And when I talk about sanitation, I'm talking mainly about the water supply. People are bathing in this water supply. They're urinating and defecating in the water supply, or if the humans aren't, animals are. They're washing their clothes in the water supply. And of course, then they're drinking it, or they're using it to cook their food in. And this is going to increase illness, especially in infants and children. It's going to increase infectious diseases. 2.4 billion people lack appropriate sanitation facilities, and so they don't have a safe water supply. So 633 million people use unsafe drinking water around the world, and migration to urban areas and cities are also creating problems. 1 billion people worldwide live in these urban areas, and more than 30% of the urban dwellers live in what would be referred to as slums. Now, when we talk about a slum, we're talking about inadequate water and inadequate sanitation, and they don't have electricity, and a lot of them have fires in their shelters so that they're cooking their food, or maybe they're cooking them outside on open fires. So they don't have what they need to store their food, to cook their food, to clean their food or themselves, or to drink that water that's clean. UNICEF, a worldwide organization, is working with about 100 countries to improve water supplies and sanitations. And I know there are a lot of charitable organizations out there that are also helping various different countries to build more wells and to bring water to clean water to the area. So inadequate shelter, inadequate sanitation. Again, 844 million people don't have access to basic water services. That means, they're traveling quite a ways. Like 263 million people travel over 30 minutes per trip one way to get water. 159 million people obtain water from streams or lakes. Now, that's really bad because if you're getting water from a stream or lake, that water is potentially filled with parasites and bacteria and other things that are bad for the body. And then people don't realize you have to either filter this water or you need to boil this water in order for it to be healthy. AIDS has had a huge impact worldwide. 37 million people worldwide are infected with this disease. And it's kind of interesting because we don't really talk about HIV and AIDS as much anymore because there are medications that decrease the symptoms. And people think, oh, well, this is, it's no big deal. It's just a disease you can live with. But does everyone have access to this extremely expensive medication? And of course, the answer is no. The virus, of course, is transmitted by contact, person to person, with bodily fluid. So that would be blood, semen, vaginal secretions, even breast milk. Sub-Saharan African countries, 34% of the world's HIV positive people live in these countries. Now, that's a ginormous issue that really nobody's talking about because you have individuals living on the continent of Africa who have this disease and they have no access to this medication. And so you still have a vast portion of the population who's dying from HIV. And what's happening is you have a huge number of children who have no parents. And because these children are orphans, who's feeding them? Who's taking care of them? Who's providing their shelter for them? And, maybe somebody's lucky enough to have grandma or uncle or aunt who can help them, but there's a lot of children who become orphans. And, these countries, they don't have the financial capabilities of supplying these children. And so now you have a lot of children who aren't making it to adulthood. So who's the farmer? Who's feeding these children? And who will become the farmer when these children, if they're lucky enough to be able to grow up? So a number of newborns also are infected. So you see a lot of children dying from HIV. In the United States, we have 1.2 million infected, and 1 in 8 people are unaware that they are infected with AIDS. And so, again, we're not really talking about it, but that's a very large population of people, even in the United States, who have this infection. And, a good question is, can we afford to help all these people? And we're not talking so much about this disease anymore. We seem to be kind of oblivious to it in this country as well. So regional statistics, Sub-Saharan Africa, you can look at 2001 versus 2013. Children and adults living with this. In 2001, about 21 million. In 2013, 25 million. So, you've had a little bit of a decrease over a 12-year period, but not a lot yearly. Okay, there's not a huge decrease. And then you see places like even Latin America, the number of cases is on the rise. And we don't talk about that. Western, Central Europe, North America, the number of cases are on the rise. 2001, 1.7 million. 2013, 2.3 million. So, we haven't gone down in the number of people who are getting HIV. It's a global issue. So towards treatment of HIV, there's no vaccine available, but we do have what are called antiretroviral drugs, and they can slow down the progression of the disease. And, again, if you've got great insurance and you can afford this and you catch it early enough, some of these drugs are able to decrease what we call the viral load, the amount of the virus in the system, to the point where it's undetectable. And it's as if you do have it and you have to keep taking these antivirals, but it's as if you kind of sort of don't have it. We don't believe you can transmit it to anybody. But these medications are very costly, over $10,000 per year. So, who gets this? So providing AIDS drugs to pregnant women, that will help prevent it being transmitted to the children. But again, not all pregnant women are going to get this. And drug companies and governments have lowered the cost of the AIDS drug for developing nations, but it's only reaching about 40% of those in need. And so that's not very much. There's now still millions of people who are going to die from this disease. So the goal is to provide universal access to treatment, care, but prevention. And, the goal was by the World Health Organization to be reached by 2015, and that goal was not reached. And we're at 2021, and the goal has still not even remotely been reached. So nutrition, it can't prevent or cure HIV or AIDS. Nutritional status does affect the disease, though. So the better nutrition a person has, the healthier their immune system. The hope is the slower progression of the disease. So, for instance, low levels of vitamin A and E can increase the early onset of symptoms. HIV positive individuals have a higher energy intake than non-infected people. So that actually means they need more nutrition than someone who doesn't have HIV. So the Nutritional Council of Registered Dietitians has been trying to work with these developing countries who have HIV issues and try to get information out to people. But, if I can't afford to buy the nutrition, what does it matter if I know all about it? So sustainable agriculture, farming systems that can definitely maintain their productivity and usefulness to society. And the goals of these would be to provide a secure living for farms and families, maintain the natural environment and resources, support the rural community, and offer respect and fair treatment to all involved, from farm workers to consumers to animals. Okay, so that kind of lets you know what the thought process of sustainable agriculture is all about. Now, for sustainable agriculture, conservation, which we talked about, letting the land go fallow, but also something called crop rotation, which means, remember I said to you before, you might have one big farmer, corporate farm, where all they grow are potatoes. In the little farm, what they used to do is they would have crop rotation. So that meant maybe this year I grow corn and next year I grow beets. And one of the reasons I'm going to do something like that, or for instance, this year I grow alfalfa, next year I grow corn. And I'm going to grow alfalfa this year because alfalfa is something we call a nitrogen fixer. And that means that alfalfa actually puts nitrogen into the soil. Well, corn is something that sucks nitrogen out of the soil. So you see, if the farmer understands the crops that they have, they're going to better understand how to grow those crops and what should be grown this year versus what should be grown next year. Then another thing that farms have done in the past is that around the outside of the farmland, they would grow particular types of trees or particular types of shrubs that would support the wildlife. And then a lot of times this wildlife would also then add to the soil and add to the crops, or just add to the income of the farmer. But the shrubs and the trees could also be like a windbreak, and they could help with the development of that crop. So you need to make sure that the quality of the soil is good. It has to be excellent for those crops to grow. And then, of course, we talked about crop variety and the nutrients in the soil that are necessary. And then pest management. Pest management is very controversial because, do we use pesticide, or how do we take care of these pests, because they're destroying my crop, and if I let the pests eat all of my crop, then me, the farmer, I'm going to be destroyed, and then I'm not going to be able to produce this crop. I can't feed anybody, so what do I do? And so there are different things. Do I, for instance, if I want to get rid of certain kind of pests, maybe I buy ladybugs and I let the ladybugs go. Or if I want to get rid of other types of pests, then I might plant certain types of crops along the edges. So certain shrubs or certain bushes are going to attract those pests to those shrubs or bushes instead of to my crop. So again, this is a lot of knowledge that the farmer has to have in order to decrease pesticide use. And then again, another big problem is the way that we farm now. So not only am I farming one type of crop, like just potato, but I might also be farming one type of animal. So maybe I'm just farming pigs, and I don't have my pigs running around in an open field. I want my pigs inside this massive, ginormous barn, and I keep thousands of pigs inside this barn. And because I have so many pigs in this barn, what the heck do I do with all this pig manure? And so in the good old days, if I had a farm where I was growing some crops and I had a few pigs, I might use the pig manure or the cow manure or the chicken manure to put on my crops, and then I could grow my crops better. But when I'm only farming a massive amount of pigs or a massive amount of cows, what do I do with all that manure? And some of the problems is you have what we call manure runoff, and that runoff gets into the water system, and now it corrodes the water system and people get sick from this. Or here's another thing, because these corporate farms need manure for their farms, they might not be able to get the manure, so instead they use fertilizer that is artificial, and it's going to have a lot of nitrogen in it and a lot of phosphorus in it, and more than what you would normally see in the soil. So this nitrogen and phosphorus, when it rains, it ends up in the water supply, and now the water supply becomes contaminated with this, and it could be contaminated with the pesticides and all too. One of the other issues too, and you see this a lot more nowadays, is you see issues with contaminated lettuce and contaminated vegetables that have like E. coli on it or salmonella on it. And that's because of the inappropriate use of some forms of manure. And what I mean by that is a lot of these corporate farms are using human manure because it's free. And that human manure can create diseases for humans. Cow manure, pig manure can cause this too, especially with new types of bacteria that are out that are antibiotic resistant. This can be a big issue as well. So biotechnology. So we're using biotechnology to improve crop yield and to decrease pesticide use. And what we're doing is we're using different techniques in the laboratory to transfer one kind of DNA from one organism into another organism. So for instance, I'm going to take a foreign DNA and I'm going to transfer it into an organism that will improve crop yield, okay? So let's say I don't want to use poison. I don't want to use a pesticide to kill off the bugs that are crawling all over my plants. I want to use something more natural. Well, instead of ladybugs, because that can be very expensive, or planting bushes on the end of my field, because those bushes actually take up space, and now I can't produce as many crops, I can't produce as much money. So now I might use biotechnology. And that biotechnology could be where I take this poison that is called BT. And I'm going to take that poison and I'm going to actually put it into a corn plant. So instead of spraying this all over the corn plant, I'm actually going to put it in the corn plant. So that now when I plant this genetically modified corn plant, okay, it has the poison in it already. Now, what this poison does is when the bug eats the corn plant, the poison causes the bug's intestines to explode and the bug dies. Well, one of the problems with biotechnology is sometimes we invent this stuff and we get it out on the market really, really fast, and we don't require as much scientific experimentation as maybe we should. And so one of the side effects has been that when you and I eat the corn plant, it causes little tiny explosions in the cells of our intestines as well. And now we've created a disease that we've never seen really in the history of mankind before, called leaky gut syndrome. And this leaky gut syndrome is causing our immune system to go crazy. And that's because you have all these holes in your small intestine that aren't supposed to be there. And this food stuff that gets into your small intestine is able to get into the bloodstream that shouldn't get into the bloodstream. And now that this stuff is in the bloodstream and the immune system has never seen it before, it goes bonkers, it goes nuts, and it starts trying to attack this food. And one of the issues is you can start developing food allergies. And we see more people with food allergies than we've ever seen before. It's like crazy, because nowadays you can't even let your kid go to school with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches because there's so many kids allergic to peanuts now. Or, there's just a ton of food allergies. Now, the other thing is too, and this has not necessarily been proven, but some doctors have suggested that this is one of the reasons we see more autoimmune diseases than we've seen before, because of this issue of leaky gut. So again, what we're doing is we're taking a trait and we're transplanting it into a plant. And now that plant is able to generate something that makes the plant itself stronger. Or for instance, tomatoes, they've been able to transplant one type of DNA into a tomato that it didn't have before, that made the skin of the tomato thicker and tougher. And because it was thicker and tougher, now bugs can't bore through the skin of the tomato. And so the tomato hangs on the vine, and that little tomato worm can't eat it up as quickly, which is one of the big serious issues for growing tomatoes. So, and then we can change plants and we can have them, because omega-3 fatty acids are so good for us, we can have these plants now produce more omega-3 fatty acids than they did before. And the question is are all these things okay for humans to consume? Is this good for us in the long run? Is this going to cause problems or issues for us? We don't really know. And of course, the companies that are making all of this have said, oh, no, we've tested it, everything is fine, which could be totally and completely accurate or totally wrong. It's always best to have corroborating data to support that information. So this technology is what we would call recombinant DNA technology. And so we call these GMO, or genetically modified organisms. So when you see something that's non-GMO, then their DNA hasn't been changed. But, the number of GMO plants and GMO animals have been increasing every year, so that, we have to label things organic or not organic so that we know if something's GMO or it's not GMO anymore. So the FDA remains confident approved varieties of GMOs are safe to consume, but public response is definitely mixed. So this is just showing you the DNA of the host plant, like I told you about corn. And then the DNA that we get, that we put into the corn, we actually get this from a bacteria, and this produces that toxin. And then the bacteria, we call it BT, is inserted, that gene is inserted into the DNA. And then, like I said, when the bug eats it, the intestines explode. So 90% of corn and 93% of soybean in the United States are genetically engineered. Now, the concern is that when we start engineering these crops to, like some crops, they've been genetically engineered not to die when you spray herbicides on them. So these chemicals that kill off weeds, they don't kill off the plant. But what we've seen is that after spraying, for instance, Roundup, that was the first herbicide that was used, where you made these genetically modified plants that they didn't die when you sprayed Roundup on them, only the weeds around them died. Now these weeds have actually mutated so that they don't die either when you spray Roundup on them. So now you have these mutant weeds that no herbicides kill them. So this is a huge problem for farmers. Now, of course, the benefit is that if you can keep these plants from hurting humans, if the plant will live longer and be stronger, then we're going to have greater crop yield, and so you'll be able to supply more food so that people don't have this undernutrition problem. So scientific analysis of 145 different types of plants this is what they've said: GMO technology reduced pesticide use by 37%. You had an increased crop yield by 22%, increased farmer profit by 68%. So this increased the value of food by $133 billion between 1996 and 2013. But of course, there's nothing to say what this has done to the health of the person or the long-term effects of now our super weeds. So let's talk about nutrition and your health over the different stages of life. So for instance, undernutrition during pregnancy. So obviously nutrition is very important. So every day, approximately 830 women die from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. And nutritional needs, are part of this. So the fetus, in order for it to develop, mom has to be eating appropriately. And typically mom is eating more than she would before for that pregnancy to be able to go the full term. And a lot of our micronutrients, very important. So one of the other things that's very important is if a mom doesn't have enough nutrients, the more pregnancy she has, the less likely she's going to be able to, what we say, recover the nutrients she needs, like iron and folate. You're not going to see those developing or increasing in her body so that she's got a good supply to be able to get pregnant. And then, of course, she has to have more to be able to maintain that pregnancy. So we have what are called Sustainable Development Goals, which these goals they've set up to be able to reduce the global maternal mortality rates. Right now, they're higher than 70 women per 100,000 live births. So we want to try to reduce it below that by 2030. So again, the growing fetus requires a lot of vitamins, proteins, minerals that mom has to supply. If we have undernutrition, this increases the risk of preterm delivery and low birth weight, which I said before is the #1 cause of fetal mortality, or infant mortality, I should say, also fetal mortality, contributes to 60 to 80% of neonatal deaths. We have abnormal growth development of those babies that do survive. And then they also have long-term health problems. And of course, obviously, that increases costs. So in childhood, the greatest impact of undernutrition occurs in the first 1,000 days of life. We want to make sure that from conception to the age of about 2, that the children have the greatest amount of nutrients available to them. This is a period of very rapid growth. The central nervous system is growing, especially the brain. And if we don't have those nutrients, you're talking stunted growth, but also permanent brain impairment. And that increases motor impairment. There can be cardiovascular issues. The child has a lot of fatigue throughout their lives, reduced stamina, learning problems. So lots of good, healthy nutrition for those first 2 years. The World Health Organization predicts significant increases in people 65 and older by the time 2050 comes along. So we'll have about 1.5 billion people 65 plus around the world. And of course, these individuals do require nutrient-dense food. And the challenges are, when you're talking about older people, they're usually on a fixed income or may have no income. And again, do they buy their medicine they need or do they buy the food that they need? So they have a lower resistance to infection because as you get older, your immune system doesn't work well. Many of them are living alone. And of course, they also have, because of the age, declining physical as well as potentially mental health. So we're going to talk about non-GMO diet. Despite mounting evidence that GMOs remain safe for consumption, the potential for unknown consequences remains. Some individuals believe that intentionally altering nature is intrinsically incorrect or immoral. A non-GMO lifestyle can include a nutritionally adequate eating pattern, which, no kidding, we've done that since the beginning of time. But it will require some inconvenience, extra cost, and close attention to food labels because we're genetically modifying all kinds of food. Specific tips to reduce or avoid GMO exposure include focus on produce. Now, okay, yes and no, because every year we're increasing the produce that's genetically modified. Right now, most fresh fruits and vegetables are non-GMO, but you cannot be 100% sure unless it is labeled organic. Okay, just be aware of that. Look for the non-GMO verified seal until GMO labeling is required. So a few years ago in California, they tried to pass a law that said that everything that was genetically modified had to be labeled as genetically modified, but that did not pass. Embrace fiber, it's a good thing anyway. Most nuts, seeds, grains, and beans are GMO free. Highly processed and packaged foods, most of those have a GMO or more than one GMO ingredient. So try to avoid processed and packaged foods. Select wild-caught seafood, especially Alaskan salmon, if you want something like that. Some farm-raised seafood contain GMOs. So what I mean by that is a lot of, like, for instance, the farm-raised trout or the farm-raised salmon, we feed them GMO corn, okay? So does that cause an issue when you eat the meat? I don't know. So here's a case study, undernutrition during childhood. Jamal traveled to the Philippines last summer. During his stay, Jamal noticed that many of the children were much shorter than the children in his neighborhood in the United States. On several occasions, he noticed young mothers crouched on curbs or in doorways holding their children. These children rarely moved. They appeared pale and listless. One evening, a nurse from the local clinic came to speak to Jamal's group. She said that many children in this area do not get enough to eat and that health problems health problems, were rampant. Jamal was shocked by such a degree of suffering. He wonders why children in the Philippines can be starving to death while so many children in his hometown in the United States have more food than they need. So hopefully after you've listened to part 1 and part 2 of this lecture, you would be able to explain why this issue is occurring. All right. Thank you so much for listening and hope you enjoyed yourself.